What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to part 3, the making of a sheath. Now, full disclosure, this is my second attempt ever at leather work of any kind. The first time was only about 3 hours before filming this video, in which I made another sheath. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be going into too much depth on the design of this sheath. I think that's a video in itself. This video is already pretty long, and I've tried to keep in as much information as possible. Please don't expect this to be a how-to video. As I said, this is the second time of me ever working with leather, so I'm not going to be doing things correctly, and some parts may seem out of the correct order. I will say, however, that this was incredibly enjoyable and I did learn a lot from it. So take this video as it's intended to be, entertainment. If you feel you won't be able to last the video without leaving a negative feedback, then I suspect you'd be better off turning over now. But if you're still watching, I hope you enjoy, and then it gives you the confidence to try something new, because here at WH Creations, I'm all about new. Yes, new's good. New's your friend. Oh, friend. So I got to what you can see now by doing lots of trial and error. I drew around the knife on a bit of paper and scanned it into my PC. Making sure it was to scale, I then started designing the shape I wanted from seeing similar ones I found on Google. Never doing anything like this before, I had to try it and imagine this 2D drawing as a 3D end product. I had to take into account the thickness of the knife as well as the thickness of the leather too. As I said earlier, this designing stage could be a video in itself, so if you want to see me go into a little bit more depth, let me know down in the comments below. I'm currently using Inkscape, which is a free vector imaging software, to get my design ready for the laser cutter. When using the laser, there are 3 main colours we need to worry about. Black being the raster engraving, or to put it simply, colouring in. Blue for vector engrave, lines or outlines. And red for vector cut, used to cut out the object. You'll see me use the number 255 on this selected colour, which is the correct number that the laser can see. I'm currently going through the design, assessing out which areas I want coloured in or rastered, which parts I want outlined, and I'll use these features to go around the rastered areas so to keep everything nice and clean and sharp. And finally, vector cut the outline of the individual parts so they're ready to get glued up and sewed together. This design has been reworked from my original to include a popper catch and belt loop. It all stems from my first incarnation, where I went from 2D to 3D to something that I could physically hold and feel for myself. What worked and what didn't. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that this finished sheath is perfect. Far from it. I took what I didn't like from my first, changed it to the second, but there are still things that I should have changed. But that comes with experience, of which I built up a lot from just these 2. I'll try and point these out as the video goes on. With the design now colour coded, I can turn the laser on and get to cutting. This laser is a K40 or a 40-watt laser engraver. It costs around £350 and is something that I'll go over in a bit more detail in an upcoming video. The leather is something I picked up a long time ago from a bargain basement, but I cannot see a single defect in this piece whatsoever, so I think I got an absolute bargain. From previous tests, it cuts beautifully, and as you can see, it engraves just as well. I suspect you're probably aware you would normally use stamps, dies or punches to cut or mark leather, but I didn't want to go down this route, as I'll probably get bored of the stamps or end up with thousands of them, which will eventually get lost or take up valuable room. Using the laser, I can customise the design to my heart's content, adding and removing designs along with adding my custom logo, which you saw me etch onto the knife in part 2. Now, I'm not saying I'm the first to try making a sheath this way, but to date I've not seen another video using this method. If however you're aware of one, please do let me know. With the pieces cut, I move into the workshop to start getting them ready for sewing. So this is my first error. I should have put my poppers on at this stage, as things got a tad bit awkward a bit later on. That being said, I scuffed up the level which will be on the inside of the sheath. I found that glue didn't bond well to this very slick surface, so keying it helped bond the material together. I used a tool called a skiver to thin out the leather where the top of the sheath meets the sew part. If I didn't thin this out, the joint would be too thick and wouldn't look very good. I placed the parts together, adding the knife to make sure it will all go together properly. Once I'm happy, I squeeze out some wood PVA glue onto the leather and then use some of these 2-inch mini clamps to hold it together. Things at this point got a little bit awkward, so I had to do a lot of this off camera. Not to mention that the camera zoomed in more than I expected for some reason.
Damn you, technology!
With all the clamps removed after around 10 minutes, I put the knife in a few times to make sure nothing on the inside had moved and the knife seats nicely into the space. Right, popping time. Again, I've not used these poppers very much, so I had to double check where the pieces go. I will say, however, that the leather kit I bought from eBay for around £13 was excellent value for money. It came with everything needed to get started with leather, from needles, twine, cutters, punches, rulers, cutting boards and even a little bit of leather to get you started. I highly recommend one if you fancy giving this a go yourself. The popper part of the fastener was simple enough. Punch a hole, put the two pieces together and hit it with a punch. Super simple, even I couldn't mess that up. I think subconsciously I thought now would be the best time to put them on, because the sheath is the finished shape, so it would make sense for layout purposes. Who knows, but trying to get the snap part on while trying to line everything up with the punch disc underneath was an absolute pain in the arse. However, it did all go together eventually and works as it should. Now using these stitching punches, I can start to lay out my holes for sewing. Normally you'd use a groove tool to set the line your stitching will follow, but me being a bit of a geek, I made these lines on the laser. See, I did learn something from my first attempt. I had to laugh though. I had bought this tool months ago because the kit never came with one, only to not actually use it. Oh well, at least I have one now. The punches are only shallow at this stage and a guide that I can follow with a bit in my drill press. With my first sheath I made the holes too large, so although my needles flew through them easily, it was more noticeable and I ended up having to double stitch the sheath to fill in the gaps. Stitching was actually a lot more fun than I expected it to be. As I'm the designated sewer in the family, I'm used to using a needle and thread, but this is all new to me. I went for the bog standard saddle stitch as it's super simple and it looks the business. I really needed a sewing horse, but I couldn't be bothered to make one, so I ended up cutting some offcuts to protect the leather while it was in the vise. It worked out pretty well, but I kept catching the thread on absolutely everything with an open end, like the handle. If you're new to this as I am, you require 2 needles which are both thread. You start by feeding one needle through your first hole and then bring them together so they're equal. From then on I always fed my right hand needle through the next hole, feeding it all the way through, then lifting it into the air so to pass the next needle through without getting it caught in the thread. This happened a few times on the first sheath, so I wanted to make sure that I did everything I could so not to happen again, because it is yet more pain in the arse. All things considered, this was actually probably the most fun part of the build. It's very therapeutic, as my wife would say. I could have quite happily sat and sewed the time away. Just sad that it was only a small sheath, so it didn't require much sewing. With the main sheath sewed, I made sure everything still fitted as it should by putting the knife in and out a few times. Being happy that everything was still good, I can now sew on the belt loop. Now I originally bought some of these copper rivets to attach the belt loop on with, but they've turned out a tad larger than I expected they would, so they wouldn't have looked right. But don't cry for me, Argentina, I will definitely be using these on larger projects, as thanks to a certain Jimmy DeResta, I think they look really cool. So I'll go back to the needle and thread and sew this into place. This was actually a bit of a pain to sew, as I was trying to use the original holes I'd used previously. To do this, however, I had to redraw the holes, and in doing so I made a fatal error by slicing through the thread. Yeah, I know, it seems basic and obvious, but at the time I wasn't really thinking. Any loose threads which came out were scorched with a lighter and melted into place. I also used CA glue here to hold everything into place while I sewed it on. Yet another amazing use for CA glue in my personal opinion, and if you don't already have 10 bottles of the stuff dotted around your workshop, I'm afraid we can't be friends. Ah, super glue friends! I kept the knife in the sheath while I sewed this on, just to make sure that the loop didn't get too tight. Worked out nice! With the sheath sewed and finished, I ran it over the sanding disc on the lathe. Another great little thing to have around the workshop, and something that is constantly used. In actual fact, I think I use the lathe more as a sander than I actually turn wood on it. All I'm doing at this stage is getting everything sanded down flush to each other, while cleaning up any discrepancies with the glue up. This was my third mistake. While designing from sheath 1 to 2, I made the stitch line approximately 4mm in from the outer edge. This is far too close, and it should have been further, but again, I'm learning, and it's something that I luckily got away with on this occasion. It's been stored in the brain library, so whenever I do this again, I'll remember to make the stitch area larger. When it's all sanded down and looking smexy, I replace the disc sander with a piece of wood which I gouged a groove into. This is to burnish the leather and give it a nice shiny finish look, alternating from the groove to the flat part depending on what part I needed burnishing. When the sheath was all burnished up, I coated it in a thick layer of my headstrong wood butter. I may be wrong, but I always thought wax is good for leather, and once buffed up gives an incredible finish. But I'm not going to be giving away the final piece de resistance. Not yet anyway. Okay. Now.